1 sec, to synchronize my AirPods. It's just...
There's a ghost behind you.
Yeah. It's
just haunting you. Fabio!
Yeah. Popping up like an owl every
Yeah.
now and then. Okay, let me share the screen. How do I do this? So this is here, and then this. Okay. Can you see the slide?
Yes.
All right, good. Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's not that common for me to have the chance to speak to such a broad audience. You know, I mean, we usually, when we do these kinds of things, it's usually very, you know, very homogeneous set of people with the same kind of background and, you know, like a lot of shared language. And this is why I set these up in a slightly different way than the standard way I usually do the talks. So I want this to be as interactive as possible. I want this to be some kind of a discussion rather than kind of me giving like a lecture or anything like that. Because I'd like to, because these are things that I'm, this is my research, it's kind of what I care about. So, and these things are not settled. So there's a lot of room for, you know, everyone's opinion. And, you know, like if you have ideas or just tell me what you think about this stuff, I'll be happy to just chat about it, because this is what I, this is what I like and this is what I do. So like there are no dumb questions. They're just, if you have questions or if something is not making a lot of sense to you, just stop me and tell me, and we can talk about it. All right. So what is the physics of information, and what is this talk about? I've organized it in three kind of sections. The first one is a little bit of like the assumption, a little bit of data, what I think is happening in physics, basically, and what I think has happened in the past 50 years. And I believe that there has been, you know, historically, physics has been about understanding energy in all of its forms and, you know, a lot of aspects of it. But basically, this has changed in the past, I would say 30 years in particular, but a bit more than that. And I'll take a look at historically how that happened, basically across the past 3 centuries. And then I'll tell you why I think this justifies a slightly different path forward and that kind of defines what is the physics of information. So the first aspect is this kind of convergence that I'm not the only one, of course, who has noticed this, but I am, you know, one of the people who decided kind of to invest heavily its career on this. So there are 4 major areas in physics that kind of witness this convergence towards the notion of information. The first one is quantum information science. So quantum information science historically was developed as a cool idea that, you know, there were standard computers. Then a bunch of scientists understood that as we progress and try to make our computer more powerful, we've used only one strategy: make the components smaller and smaller, so that basically our computer are the same size but more powerful because they can make more operations. But of course, this strategy has a limit, because when things get too small, you cannot use your standard physical arguments. You need to face the challenges from quantum mechanics. And if you do want to have a computer that works with that sort of stuff, you need quantum information science, which is understanding how quantum systems basically talk to each other. Now, this has had this thing has two sides. On the one hand, basically people have understood how, in principle, this can be done. But on the other hand, this push towards these kinds of new technology has unraveled a lot of the basically basic understanding of quantum systems. Because in a slightly different sense, information theory is giving us a new language to describe physical system, irrespectively of what you want to do with these things. And that's why I think it's so useful. But this has been, I mean, in quantum physics, now a huge portion of quantum physics uses tools from quantum information science. It's really all encompassing. Now, the other side is, the second side is fundamental physics. These ideas from information theory, which is the theory that we use to describe basically computers, has percolated even in fundamental physics. Like Bruno was saying, I worked in loop quantum gravity, which is one attempt to merge general relativity and quantum mechanics. And even in those fundamental theories, you need notions of information theory, like notions like entropy and compression, to understand and to try to make some physics with these abstract systems. So this is the second aspect. And the third one, which is maybe more related to what you guys do, is non-equilibrium physics. What happened there is basically in the 90s, a bunch of people were trying to understand better the physics of systems that were not in thermal equilibrium, which are like biological systems are a prime example of these sort of systems. And they stumbled upon a number of interesting mathematical relations that basically convey a lot of information about the behavior of the system. But the weird thing is that the kind of the implications of this are really profound. And one of the implications, and we'll talk about this more later, is that you can convert information into energy and vice versa. You can convert energy into information. So for example, one consequence of this is that when you forget something, your brain heats up. It releases a certain amount of heat, which is really weird. And this is actually a physical process that has been measured. And like the technical statement is that when you erase one bit of information in an environment that has a certain temperature, basically you have to release a certain amount of heat that is proportional to the temperature of the environment. So there is this kind of duality between concept from information theory, like the concept of entropy, and more standard concept like heat and work in physics. The last one is what has been called the unreasonable effectiveness of data. And I mean, if you think about the evolution of the scientific process and the scientific method, what has happened in the past 20 years in terms of machine learning, AI, it's really unprecedented. Before, our way of doing physics was very, very different. Now, you can, in principle, with this black box approach, you can, in principle, have this machine that you don't know what it's doing. You feed it a bunch of data. It gives you a representation of this data that you can use. And it's very, very effective. But a lot of times, we really don't understand how and why is that effective. And as a result, unfortunately, sometimes we don't even, when it fails, we don't understand why it does so. But the point that I want to make is that if you look at across physics, like fundamental and applied physics, you look at statistical mechanics, quantum physics, the notions from information theory and the ideas around information are percolating, they're everywhere, basically, nowadays in physics. But they appear as a set of tools. So in other words, there are no unifying and core principles behind it. There's a language, and we know kind of how this language works, but there are no dynamical principles behind it. And this is kind of what I want to do and what I'm interested in doing. And so to get a more detailed sense of what I mean with that statement, I took a look at the physics of energy, the standard physics that we have done in the past 3 centuries. So if you look at, this is a graph that I took from a paper that a professor here at UC Davis published on dialogues on clinical neuroscience. I don't know why that paper is in that journal because it's about something else. But so here you can see on the x-axis is basically time in the past, like 3 centuries. And in the vertical axis is some form of progress estimated with GDP, the gross domestic product, and the energy consumption. And these are, as you can see, it's divided. Let me actually highlight it with pointer. It's divided into sections. And these sections represent the main energy source that was used at the time. We had water power, then steam, then of course the electric power, then combustion. And then what happened in the 70s was that we started using transistors and what has been called information and communication technologies. And, if we look at the foundation, the physical foundation of these huge progress, we see that basically the physics was understood in the early phase, basically in the second half of the 19th century. And my argument is that there are 2 key things that we understood about energy that drove these massive progress. The first one was that we understood the macroscopic transformation rules. And these, for all extent and purposes, was done with thermodynamics. And, people who work in medical sciences, in chemical sciences, and in biology are probably the ones that benefited the most from these understandings. Because what happened was that basically from the original works that was done on ideal gases, through the modern understanding of thermodynamics and statistical mechanics, they laid the foundations for basically the whole chemistry, like the fact that, reaction rates depend on temperature, for example. And this is the core foundations for modern medicine, biology, and a lot of the life sciences. But at the conceptual level, what thermodynamics does, is that it tells you if you want to use a certain source of energy, what you need to do is you need to transform its kind from one type to another. Like, for example, transforming potential energy into useful work. These things have a cost. You cannot just do them in whatever way you want to. There are laws that regulate this behavior. And this was understood by thermodynamics, using thermodynamics. The second aspect is understanding its microscopic nature. And this was done with classical mechanics, or what theoretical physicists call Hamiltonian and Lagrangian mechanics, and then with quantum mechanics. And this is the historic path that has led to this kind of modern understanding of the microscopic nature of energy. And basically, after the advent of quantum mechanics, these led to like a huge exploit of new technology, like with nuclear energy, of course, the transistors that form the basis, you know, the whole semiconductor physics that forms the basis of our modern technology. I mean, all our smartphones or all our computers are based on these sort of things. And of course, also lasers. So my point is that if we look at the understanding of energy, these two aspects, comprehending the macroscopic transformation rules, how to exchange energy at the macroscopic level, and its microscopic nature, they were the ones that fueled virtually all the industrial revolution, the progress that we have seen in society in the past 200, 300 years. And of course, their connection, the connection between the microscopic and the macroscopic nature, it's of statistical nature. People who have studied statistical mechanics knows very well. Actually, should I ask how many physicists, pure physicists, are in the room, and how many non-physicists, just to have an idea?
Okay, so
Physicists here.
Yeah, there are three of us who are pure physicists. One of us is doing a master's in physics, and another one is a medical physicist.
Okay.
Then I have three biologists, no, four biologists, so people in the biological sciences. So it's
Okay.
roughly half and half.
Okay. All right.
Hi.
Okay. Hello.
Here. This is here.
Okay. It's just I don't want to say, you know, like things that are too easy or like completely off track in terms of what assumptions.
No, I think it's just fine.
Okay.
You're doing great. Yeah.
All right. All right. So what is the point of this, you know, rambling? Is that this is what we have for energy. It's a principled framework, which means that we understood what the rules of the game are. We understood, for example, that there are a set of principles that are always true, like energy is conserved. And this has a huge effect, because understanding the rules of the game are the first step to actually playing the game and you know, playing it at a good level. So for example, when we have a process, we check its energy at the beginning and at the end, and we see that energy doesn't match, we understand that it's our fault. We know that we are ignoring something, because we do know that at the fundamental level, energy must be conserved. It can only be transformed. And this has a huge impact on the way we think about processes and physics. Another rules that we understand that it's obviously connected is that energy transformation cannot be 100% efficient at the macroscopic level. And this was the thermodynamic origin of the notion of entropy. And there is, of course, there's a bunch of more detailed rules of the game, which are, for example, the way classical mechanics works, so the point for the physicist is the variational principle with the stationary action principle, right? And then, of course, this is connected with quantum mechanics and with more advanced theories. But the point is that we understand what the rules of the game are. Now, this is not entirely true for concept of like, you know, entropy and information. But we do know a certain number of things. We know that at the most fundamental level, what we call information must be conserved. And this is due to the fact that quantum mechanics, at the most fundamental level of nature, we have quantum mechanics. And quantum systems, they evolve in a way that it's dictated by an equation that's called Schrödinger's equation. And under this evolution, information is by definition conserved. It's called a unitary evolution that preserves any sort of information. We also understand that information needs a physical support. You know, a bit, it's irrespective of the fact that when we think about it, we think about it in an abstract sense. A bit of information, it's something that needs a physical support. For example, it can be the light in your room that it's turned on or turned off. Or it can be, you know, in a semiconductor, it can be a transistor that it's in one state or in another state. It really can be anything. And that's the advantage of information theory. But it does need some form of physical support. And because of that, it leaves physical traces. Like, for example, now we understand that forms of information are resources that can be traded for, you know, any other form of energy, like heat, work, or even chemical potential. And what these mean, like in practical terms, what happens is basically that when you look at the thermodynamics of a small system, you know that there are various terms involved. There is entropy, there is potential, there is internal energy, there's work, there's heat, there's the chemical nature, but there's also information. So for example, if your system has some form of feedback mechanisms that feed it information, that gives you a term in the first law of thermodynamics that you cannot ignore, otherwise your equations will be wrong. And if you're interested in these sort of things, there's a theory that's called stochastic thermodynamics that does exactly that. And the fourth thing is that the fourth thing that we know about information is that it has the ultimate flexibility in describing natural systems. And what I mean is that it really is an abstraction of what we understand and the way we characterize the system. I've given you this example before. A bit of information can be anything, right? It can be a light turned on, turned off. It can be a transistor in one state or another. It can be the state of a protein, that it's folded or unfolded. It really can be anything. So it's describing systems with these with probabilities and information is extremely flexible, and yet you can get a lot of information just from these description. So think about the fact that, you know, we can describe DNA and RNA in terms of basis and transmission of biological information to the progeny. Or you can think about other examples like quantum information theory or the thermodynamics of small systems. There's of course data analysis, dynamical systems. I mean, you name it. It really is everywhere. So what we do not know, what we do not know is if there's a general set of principles dynamically, and what are the key notions in this. It's in information theory, as like the notion of symmetry in physics plays a huge role, and yet it seems that when we study the information theory of natural systems, this is often not included. And the third aspect is the interface with energetics. So if, like I said, notions of information are basically tied with the notion of energy, there is of course a relation between the two. So how does having more information affect the amount of energy you have at your disposal, and vice versa? So these things are generally, the general principles are not at all understood. So the main point that I want to make is that this is a principled framework that we have for energy, and it's just not there for notions of information. But I do believe that developing a similar principled framework for the informational aspects of a physical system is absolutely fundamental to kind of sustain the information revolution that we're living in right now. And so how do we do that? I think there's a nice theory that we can use to do something like that is not completely developed, but that I've been working on, and it's called computational mechanics. And so this is kind of, and I'll show you what it means to study a system using these tools of computational mechanics and understanding the informational properties of a physical system using these tools. And it was, I came in contact with this theory here at UC Davis, and he was spearheaded by my PI, James Crutchfield. And he comes from, theory of dynamical systems, but he really has this broad approach in which he has done, he has applied this theory to understand networks of terrorists, biological information. It's really, now it's using it to understand language in whales, for example. And so it really is incredibly flexible. And this is why I like it, and this is why I think it can be extremely useful to extract the principles of the physics of information. So imagine you have your physical system, which is, this nice blue box with whatever it is that it's inside. And that thing is spitting out states. So your system can be in a certain time series of states. You have state 0, state 1, state 2, state 3. And this is left kind of broad on purpose. So this could be, for example, it could be a source of light that emits photons, and you look at their states. Or it could be the same system on which you make some form of measurement and you record the measurement. It really can be anything. But the point is that you have a certain number of states, which in this case, as usual, we make the easiest example that there are only 2 states. It can be, for example, that you're looking at a protein and you change the condition and you record whether it's folded or it's unfolded. And you want to understand what are the conditions that force the protein to do the transition, for example. When does that happen, and if there is some form of dynamic that triggers that? So let's imagine that whatever your system is can be in only 2 states, 0 and 1. And let's look at the simplest time series of states. It's homogeneous. It's the same thing. It's 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Right. How would you represent that? One simple way of doing this is the following. It's with this diagram. So this symbol here, A, it's what it's called the causal states. The idea behind this is that of a machine. You are in a certain state, say this one, 0. You crank the machine. You're in state A, you follow the arrow, and in this case, you just go back to the same state A. And while you do that, you emit a symbol 0 with a certain probability. Now, in this case, of course, there's only one symbol. It's always the same state. And therefore, there's only, there's 100% probability that the next one will be the same. Now, what does that mean? First of all, this is like a trivial series, right? And so there are 2 key indicators that we use to study this series. The first one is H, and it's called entropy rate. And the second one is C, and it's called the complexity of the model. And I'll explain what these are in kind of without math, just conceptually. So H is basically the amount of randomness that you have in this series. And what this means is that H gives you a quantitative answer to the following question. Imagine that, Bruno knows the time series up to whatever, this time. And then he asks, what is the probability that I can predict the next symbol? Now, in this case, he has, because of the nature of the time series, he has 100%, he'll know for sure what the next symbol is. It's fully predictive, so there is no randomness whatsoever. Of course, this is not always the case, but this is just one way of introducing this concept. So H evaluates the amount of randomness that is created dynamically in the series. And it corresponds to the fact that if you have a certain knowledge at a certain point in time, due to the fact that your system evolves in time in a way that it's not exactly predictable, you lose a little bit of this predictivity. And the way to quantify this loss of predictability over time is this number H here. So for the people who are interested in the math, it's an entropy rate, and it's basically a notion of produced entropy at each time step.
It's like entropy per bit.
Yes, it's entropy. It's entropy divided by time.
Okay.
So it's the amount of entropy per time step on average.
Okay, cool.
How does what's the behavior of this H with a pseudo-random number generator?
Sorry?
If you have like a random number generator, you have an algorithm that spits out something that statistically looks like a random sequence, but have probably internal state or some kind of rule, that if you actually know which is the rule that this comes from, with enough data, you can basically generate the entire series. So intuitively, it would feel to me that this H wouldn't be able to capture the fact that this series is actually very low information dense. No, because you're not aware of the underlying algorithm that is generating it.
Oh, you're saying if you're not aware of it? Yeah,
because for example, I can have a bit string that's generated by this random generator. Someone handles this to you. Is this a truly randomly generated sequence, or is a pseudo-random sequence? Can you tell them apart if you're not sure what's underlying it?
Yes. So the answer to that question has two parts. So strictly speaking, if you can, what we are assuming right now, because of the sake of the argument, is that you can look at infinitely long series.
Okay, fair, sure.
So a pseudo random number generators has a time scale after which is not really random anymore, right?
It is a ridiculous large time scale, but yes.
Yeah, agreed. So this is what these things do. These are things that if you look long enough, you will realize that your real H is actually 0.
Okay, so the proper physical H is somewhat a limit of this intermediary H.
Yes, and then, so there is the real H, and then there is the one that you reconstruct from your data.
Okay, you have like this time-limited H, and you have the actual full H that you're trying to figure out.
Exactly. So this the way the full H is described is that you have your finite time H, and then you do the limit for the time.
Okay, makes sense. that's how you bypass the.
Yeah.
So
okay. Pseudo-random number generators are the ones that for which this H, as a function of L of the time size, has like a step behavior. So it's super high for basically a long time, and then you realize, oh no, but it's periodic, and then it goes to 0.
Yeah, either periodic or at least it have a tail somehow. That's
Yeah, I was making like the
simplest assumption periodic. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and what they do. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Is this the same problem of defining like this thermodynamic limit in original thermodynamics? Like you actually have to go to very large sizes, so you kind of bypass all this limitation, or not the same thing?
I mean, I guess it really depends what you mean. So there are problems in which this is the way we formulated it. This is data reconstruction problem, right? Okay. And having more data, sure, the need to have infinite amount of data, you can assimilate to the thermodynamic limit. Sure. Okay. But I'm guessing that you were asking something slightly different, something more physical.
No, probably my answer is going to come later in your talk. Just probably go on. It's going to be better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. No, and keep asking questions. I mean, this is how I'd like it to be. I'd like to, have a discussion on these issues. So the other object C is called the complexity of the model. And in this case, again, I mean, this is the most trivial series, so everything is 0 and it's a stupid series, but this gives me a chance to talk about the complexity. Now, the complexity of the model is related to the number of causal states that we have. And in this case, we have only one state, which means that the rules that generate the series, it's always the same, and it's always one kind. If there are more kinds of rules that are involved in generating the time series, then this complexity will not be 0. So for example, let's look at another example, the alternating series of 0 and 1, right? 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. How would this be represented? Like this. We have two states. In state A, there is 100% chance of generating the state 0. And in B, there's 100% chance of seeing that your system is in state 1. And of course, what's happening is that the system is switching continuously between A and B, A and B, A and B, A and B. So first question is there any randomness in these time series? The answer is no. After you've seen the first two, basically, you've seen 0 and 1, there's no randomness whatsoever. You can predict exactly infinitely long sequences of this. So there is no randomness. But the complexity is a bit higher. Why? Because you need two states to explain these series. You need the state A, the rule A, and you need the rule B. Rule A would be emit a 0 with 100% chance, and rule B would be emit a 1 with 100% chance. The complexity, so for people who are more mathy, what you do is basically by following a time series, you record the states. And I mean, in this case, you can see that the system is jumping from A to B, and then back to A. right? So it will populate with equal probability both state A and state B. And so the entropy of these probability distribution in base 2 will be 1. And this is the definition of the statistical complexity. Now, of course, and this is the whole point, most series are not like this one. Like, for example, let's have a look at this series. This is our third example in which I've taken a coin, I flipped it, and I record. If it's head, I pick it 0. If it's tail, I pick 1. How is this represented? This is represented in the following way. You have still one state because the way you generate the dynamics, it's always the same. It's basically 50-50 chance of having a 0 and a 1. And so this model has no complexity because the state is always the same. You have a random choice between 0 and 1, but it does have randomness, right? At each time, the next symbol, you have no idea what the next symbol will be. The only way for you to know is to actually make a measurement and see what happens. So you have no information about the next symbol. And so this would be an entropy rate 1 and a statistical complexity of 0, because there's only one way in which you're generating the rules. And of course, now I have given you an example in which you have, the stupid series, an example in which we had complexity, but not randomness. And this third example is the one in which you have randomness, but no complexity. Now, most series lie anywhere in between these two extreme examples. And here, it's a simple one. And you can see how patterns emerge in the time series because of their behavior, and they're explained by the rules. So for example, in this series, you have a 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0. So you notice, the first thing that we notice is that zeros always come in pair. And you can check that this is always true. So what happens is that the way you codify this behavior in the evolution of the system is by establishing basically this set of rules. There are two states, A and B, and these causal states are the rules that generate the next symbol. So there are two kinds of rules to generate the next symbol the system can choose from. In rule A, there's a 100% chance of generating a 0. In rule B, there's a 50% chance of generating a 1 and a 50% chance of generating a 0. So if you're here, say that you're here, you start in A, you emit a 0, and you transition to B. Maybe the first time you get a 1, and then you stay in state B, and then you get a 0, and you transition to state A. And so this is what happened, for example, here. It's a 0, then a 1, because you're staying in state B. Then another 1, staying in state B. And then you see a 0, which means that you have transitioned from state B to state A. And therefore, you have to see another 0. And this is why the zeros come in pairs. And this is how these machines are able to basically codify whatever behavior of your time series in a way that it's that it's rules oriented. And for example, if you
can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So this type of network is really fascinating. I was thinking about ways of applying this to biology. One thing that occurred to me was the neuroproliferative pathways, where you generate neurons in different types of cell, and this is generated by having types of proliferative cells differentiating into others. So you have one type of cell, another type of cell with a certain probability and does this and does that. But not crucial, but the one thing that is really definitely about this type of network is that it's a tree. So it never comes back to previous states and always ends in some sort of absorbing state. See what I mean? So if you have a system like that, where there are no loopbacks, you have just a complex tree and eventually you end up in one specific final state. How would the complexity and the entropy ratio of such a system behave?
So, okay, two things. First, I'm giving you the simplest examples because those are the ones that are easier to explain. But we can treat even situations in which the number of causal states, these A and B, are infinite. And one example in which you do create these sort of infinities is like tree structure. And what happens is that these tree kind of structure are part of a larger machine. So the way you usually describe them is as they're a subpart of a larger machine. Now, I'm not that, so this is the technical answer. So this is how you do that. Can you kind of explain to me again the example of why exactly is a tree structure?
Okay, so imagine you have and Kami, you're behind him. So if I say something wrong, you just tell me, okay?
She's not hearing you.
Okay.
I have AirPods.
We start with a type of cell that is called a radioglia, okay? And this radioglia, it splits in half and generates on a neuron, or like vertically, or it splits horizontally and generates two radioglia. Okay, so so you can choose one of those two pathways. Okay, but as soon as you stop dividing like this and stop dividing like this, you never can split like this again. Okay, so you start from a state what you can call splitting radioglia, and then you move to a state where you're creating new neurons. Okay. You cannot go back. And then this glia can move upwards and become an outer radioglia, or it can divide two and become an intermediate progenitor cell. Okay, and all of these generate neurons, but they not go back. And eventually they stop producing neurons and start producing glia, astrocytes and everything. Okay, and then it can die or it can migrate upwards, right? So your wife's astrocytes, they're produced these later stages. Okay, so if you think of this as a network, it's really a tree. You have an initial state, and it can stay at that state or branch out to a different state, and that state branches out. So you have this tree that's branching out. Eventually, it ends, it stops. So it's like you're generating a sequence of numbers that is finite, and it's zero forever, ever afterwards.
So, and why does it stop?
Because they stop proliferating, they stop generating neurons.
So the proliferation stops altogether.
Stops altogether, and then you stuck with the neurons that you have. For most of the cortex, there's some exceptions, but for the most of the cortex,
this stop would be a transition to a stationary state, in which like everything is thermal, or you reached whatever you wanted to do and now nothing else is changing.
Yes.
So what I have in mind is that I don't think this is the exact way to use these machines. So if I look at the tree structure that you described, the tree structure is more like the decision. It's more like what is happening at the system. So this would be some form of organization of the ones and zeros.
Okay.
So it would be like producing new numbers. So it would be like there's a 0 first, then there's a 1, then there's a 2, then there's a 3, then there's a 4, or something like that.
Okay.
Now the logic that regulates the transition between these numbers can be encoded with these. And in this case, this would be, for example, going from A to, let me call it A1 to A2 to A3 to A4 to A5, and then stopping altogether, which means going into kind of the stasis or whatever, you know, like a trivial state in which nothing else changes.
Yeah, so you can have like various paths from a start state. And the thing is that biologically, different paths will generate different numbers of neurons. Okay? Because the neurons themselves do not reproduce. They are generated and they just move up. So these proliferative cells are the ones that generate neurons. So perhaps you have this one path that generates 5 neurons, but this other path generates 30 neurons. This other path generates 50 or 100. And if you look at different species, you see that different paths are present at different rates, and that largely explains why, say, humans have more neurons than monkeys, that have more neurons than rabbits. Okay. So network can actually help understand the eventual structure of the cortex.
It can definitely allow you to make quantitative statements about it.
Okay.
If you identify the reliable macro states that you would call that, so these would be your logical states, 0 and 1, or 0, 1, 2, or whatever, you know, what the number is, then not like understanding the logic, the maps, one logical state, sorry, the rules that map one logical state into another one, then make the transition, will certainly allow you to make quantitative statement about, for example, the complexity of these, of the growth of human brain with respect to, I don't know, like rabbits or monkeys. Yeah, for sure, because you can tell right away, for example, that, I mean, this is not always the case, but it's obvious how there's a connection. Say that in, and I'm making a very trivial example here that's probably not correct, but this is the kind of one thing that I have in mind. Say that at the most trivial level, humans are described by a system like this with a larger alphabet. So instead of having 0, 1, they have 0, 1, and 3. Of course, the possibilities in terms of the rules that are there are the ones that you had in 0 and 1, plus something else, of course. Right? And so when you increase the alphabet, you're potentially increasing also the amount of randomness and complexity that you can have in that model. So definitely, if you have, you know, across evolution systems that you know that you can describe with a certain number of logical states, then you can compare. You can compare them between classes and within the same class.
Okay. Yeah, I'll think about it because I think that's a very promising approach to understand this whole system.
I know. This is why I love these kinds of approach. It really is like, I mean, it's up to you, whatever you want to do with it. It's a set of logic statements that allows you to describe systems. And, you know, I have been trying to use this to describe, you know, open quantum systems. So like systems in thermodynamics that for which you cannot, you know, forget quantum effects or non-equilibrium effects. But really, it can be anything. This is the ultimate flexibility.
Okay, and can I ask you another question? I'm sorry if I'm
No. This is
if my analogy is correct, then the set of states and transition probabilities are the equivalent of the microstate in a thermodynamical system, and the sequence S is the macrostate. Is that a correct analogy?
No, not entirely, but almost. So, okay, what's the best example of that? So knowing the microstate doesn't do you any good if you don't know what the Hamiltonian is.
Okay, which leads me to the second question, which is this. Imagine I have a sequence. Can you compute two things? One, how many different sets of states and transitions can generate the same sequence? And what is the simplest set of microstates and transitions that can generate the same sequence, and in a way that's analogous to a common law of complexity?
So these are called, I didn't talk about it because these are more, of course, complex notions. But to answer your question, there's a series of algorithms that people have developed that do exactly that. They take a bunch of data, they run it through the algorithms, and they extract the simplest model that describes that series. The simplest meaning the following: the one that requires less memory space and smaller complexity. So the simplest in the sense that the amount of causal states that you need, of the rules that you need, is the lowest possible. These objects are called epsilon machine because there's a bunch of theorems that, you know, with the epsilon as small as possible, all those stuff. But the core idea is that you take the data, you take the time series, and ideally you have access to as many data as possible, of course. You run it through the algorithm. What this set of algorithms do is that they identify basically the easiest model that explains that data. And of course, if the amount of data that you have is very low, it's not gonna, I mean, this is not gonna do you any good, because it's gonna give you a very poor representation of what really happens. But if you do have access to a lot of data, what that does is that those kind of fluctuations and long behavior in time will allow you to reconstruct in detail what's happening behind this and what is creating that dynamical behavior. And of course, like you said, like what you were hinting at is that this same time series can be explained in different ways. And that is absolutely correct. But these things have a hierarchy. Okay. And so you take the minimum one, the one that has less randomness and the one that has less complexity. And that one is unique. There's only one minimum, basically.
May I ask you two simpler questions?
Mm-hmm.
First, exactly on this slide, if you have a series that have ones followed by increasing number of zeros after each one. So you have a 1, 1 0, 1, 2 zeros, 1, 3 zeros, 1.
Okay.
What agency looks like? Probably 0, because it's very predictable. Is that it? And C is big.
I don't know. I'm sure we can draw it together. But so how would that look like? So you said 1 0. No, sorry. It was 0 1 2 0, then a 1, then 3 0, then a 1, and so on.
Yeah. It's a very regular, but it's not constant series.
Yeah. I think I can draw it. Let me just think for a second. Actually, this is perfect to stop here. And then do this. Let me move to my iPad. Okay, can you see the iPad?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so you said something like 0, 1, 0, 0, 1.
Exactly. That's it. 4 zeros, 1.
Okay, so this could be, so producing a 1, it's definitely one causal state. So, okay, the technical, if you want to know the technical statement, causal states are defined in the following way. Before I answer the concrete question,
Sure.
let me answer the general one. So if you have, take your time series and split it in two. This part is the past. This is the future. And this is your present. Okay. And you can choose whether to include the present with the past or the future. It really doesn't matter. Now, let me identify S vector is S vector with the P is the possible observed values of the past, and SF is the possible observed values of the future. Now, a causal state is identified in the following way. When two possible pasts, they give you the same conditional future. So take SP and S tilde P. They're two different pasts. Whenever the conditional probability of observing a certain future given the past is equal, you declare that SP and S tilde P are basically, you set up an equivalence relation, and that creates your causal state. So basically what causal states are past behavior that lead to exactly the same future. And this is what allows you to identify the rules of the game that are different from each other. And this is what the algorithm does. It takes your series, it parses it, and it reconstructs the conditionals, and it puts them together into macro states that have the same future behavior given different pasts. And these are called causal states. Now, with respect to this specific case, you would have something like this. So let's say that, let me call A would mean producing a 1. And then you can have B with 100%. Then a B would be produce zero. B2 would be something like produce 0, 0, and so on and so forth. So this would be something like this. then you go back to A. I don't know. I don't know how can you write it, but you just need to, I mean, you can run the algorithms and we can probably find that out, but it's going to take me a bit because what you need to do is lump together paths that give you the same behavior. And like you said, this is regular. So this should have 0 entropy rate and a certain, complexity.
It's not an infinite series of that diagram or something like this.
Say it again.
You go to one loop and it's nothing like an infinite series of that diagram. So you enter the first loop, and then you go to the next.
Yeah, it is something like that. Yes, it is definitely something like that. So you have, so it's like A that goes to B1, and then goes to A, then goes to B2, and so on and so forth. So this is definitely the time series of the causal states that you occupy, right? So this would be like, take whatever machine and record the state that you're using. Now the logic behind this, it's a step forward from this diagram. Because the diagrams are about emitting the single symbol. Yes, this is definitely, so this is one representation for sure of the process, but this doesn't give you it doesn't give you the quantitative information that you want to. Like, for example, well, I mean, we have established the rules. So in some sense, what I think was Jose who asked the question, you implicitly set up the rules of this game, right? So in some sense, what you gave me were exactly the information to generate the time series. This is how you communicated to me, right? You said there's a 0. So in some sense, you gave me those rules. One just needs the right diagrammatic way of representing the rules. But of course, by definition, you didn't need an infinite amount of words to convey that information to me, right? So it's definitely, you can compress it. And I mean, this actually has no randomness, right? Because it's a deterministically generated time series, but it definitely has some complexity. I'm just not sure what that is. Yeah.
And maybe you can get a series of the logs like we have on the previous slides, and we can take something from that series. I'm just guessing now to get the complexity. In each step, you have a log of something, and you sum, and then the sum of that log will have a relation, maybe. Maybe we can get something like that, but it's just guessing.
No, I think this is a bit more complex. Because the example that we're looking at here has definitely, it has a non-recurring behavior. It always changes, right?
Yes.
So it's just slightly different, but you can represent it in the same way. I mean, okay, now that there are like as you know, when you want to prove all these theorems, you usually, in like hard prove them, you usually need a bunch of assumptions. And the core assumption that that people use to prove the results are usually that the time series is stationary, which yours, it's not exactly stationary because it has a beginning and it has an ever-changing behavior. But we do know from case-to-case analysis, so not from the general theory, but from practical analysis, we know that concepts like these ones can actually be used in time series that are not stationary. We just don't have the full theory yet. So the full theory is well developed for stationary time series, and the algorithms work well. Of course, there are computational prices that you need to pay. This is really heavy from the computational perspective. But from the conceptual perspective, there is no problem as long as the series is stationary. If the series is stationary, the theory is not well developed yet. So, like for example, the case that we were looking at, I do think there is a representation like that, for which I do think that we can extract the complexity, but there is no like guaranteed way of doing it. You just need to figure the solution for that specific example, because this series is not stationary. So the general algorithm that we use for stationary series are not guaranteed to work. In certain cases, they do work and they give you regular structure that you can study and you can evaluate their complexity. But yeah. So like in this case, it's regular enough so that we can study it. But I'm just not sure what is the optimal representation of that dynamic.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Sure. But this is definitely an interesting example that now it's in my mind. I have to come up with a good machine that represents it. Yeah. It's probably going to be like a nested series of loops. Yeah, I don't know. I'll think about it. But yeah, I mean, this is actually, I don't think this is already a lot of times that we've spent on this. So so the only thing that was left to mention in as far as the talk goes was that what I'm doing at the practical level is using these, well, first of all, pushing forward these ideas in regimes where we know like they need some more work, like non-stationary series. It's one of these things. But the other thing is, how do you use these ideas to represent the dynamics of quantum systems? Because there it's a whole different game, because it's very, very different. Let's just leave it like that. Things are not, you have something more than just classical probability distributions. You have complex numbers and you have operators. And so it's even despite the fact that conceptually some of the ideas can obviously be mapped onto quantum systems, understanding how to use these ideas for understanding the dynamics of quantum systems it's highly non-trivial, and coming up with algorithms that work also for quantum systems, it's highly non-trivial. And so this is what I've been working on. But yeah, the main message that I like, the reason why I thought that this could be, that I hope is useful for some of you, is that this is really a very flexible way of thinking about systems, and yet it can be made rigorous and quantitative. So I'm hoping that more people will use it, because I think it's very useful and it does yield results. Yeah, and I think biological systems like the ones you work on could be a really good example, kind of test bed, where to test these ideas and whether they're actually useful, not just in theory, but to actually solve and answer practical questions. Yeah.
Okay, so
That's it.
thank you very, very much. This is fascinating. And I have like 100 different questions. I'll try to ask just a few of them so I can let everyone else ask them. But okay, let's first go back to that example I gave to you about the neuroproliferative processes of generating new cells. There are two things that I think one needs to understand about these processes that I don't think I think are poorly understood, not well posed for most biologists. The first is that these cannot be very complex networks because they're defined by a very small amount of genetic material, right? So I mean, even though it's very complex, right, it's something that ultimately encoded in a few kilobits of information, okay? So that's one of the, I think, important questions about biology. How you can have something that's seemingly very complex, but from a very low information, a very small amount of information. That's the first thing. The second thing is that this process seems to be very robust, because during development, a number of things can happen, from nutrition to viruses to everything. And still we generate something that looks and works like a process, a functioning brain. So the question about a network like this that might help to answer is how you generate something with little amount of information that's extremely robust. Okay, so that's what I'm really interested in understanding. And I don't know if you have any ideas about that, but what do you think?
So the first comment is that one needs to be careful about originated, like the fact that you have at the beginning a small amount of information. You can have, it really doesn't mean anything in terms of the complexity of the underlying dynamic. Because, for example, you could have time series which have time series of zeros and ones that have an infinite number of causal states.
Okay.
So their statistical complexity is infinite.
Okay.
And yet they are generated from sequences of 0 and 1.
Okay. But I think in the case of the neurons, we have like the opposite effect, which is that you have like relatively few causal states generate a very complex time series. See what I mean? So
why is it the opposite?
no, because I think in the case of the neurons, what you have is like a very small number of potential causal states. Okay, perhaps a few per time.
Okay. So you're saying, okay, the rules are low. The number of rules is low.
Yes, the number of rules is low.
Okay.
The output is very diverse and very complex.
Okay, that's not a big. Well, I mean that could be. Okay, I'm gonna make a statement which I don't know if that's true or not, but if I have 5 different rules that can generate dynamics of zeros and ones, the possible futures that I can create, it probably scales in some exponential form with 5, where 5 is the rate.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, the statistical complexity is basically the entropy of the stationary distribution over the causal states.
Okay.
And so if you have a certain number of, and that evaluates the growth of the complexity of your time series. So it is a scaling thing. It's not an absolute number. So I think that numbers, and because it's entropy, it goes with it's like a log of the number of possible states. So I think that that increasing complexity could just be the fact that when you understand the rules of the game, the possible behavior that you see, there's an exponential factor that scales with the entropy of the statistical complexity. So that could be one.
Okay, and any thoughts on the robustness problem?
I think the robustness, we need to be more, or at least there are two senses in which I understand robustness. One is this is kind of what we're doing is looking at the logical structure behind it, but the logical structure of the network. So there is a robustness that it's inherent to the problem, and it's one of energetic nature. And so in other words, those logical states are stable states because the conditions don't change. And so there's a robustness that it's intrinsic to that system. Otherwise, you wouldn't call those logical states. And so, for example, if I have the same conditions and I change the temperature from environmental to standard, from standard condition to 200 degrees, I would expect that those logical states just disappear because things are just do not, the logic of the problem is completely flawed at that temperature. So this is one notion of robustness that I'm thinking about. And the other one is, okay, you have these conditions, but then of course things can happen that slightly change the rules of the game, right? That they perturb the dynamic a little bit. Mm-hmm. Right? And those rules of the game, to some extent, do not change that much, in the sense that when you change the environmental conditions, there is a slight change in the rules of the game, but it's not too big. And so you maintain the same structure. So I'm guessing you're thinking about the second kind of robustness?
Yeah, mostly yes.
And you're thinking about external perturbations due to what?
Okay, so it can be, say, a virus that kills progenitor cells. It can be, say, a failure of nutrition. It can be a mechanical impact. What I'm thinking is something, in terms of your model, something like, imagine you run the same model with like probabilistic transition probabilities, but you change the probabilities from one instance to the other, and you want your output to be robust to these changes of probability. Mm-hmm. And remember that we are talking about processes generate, say, neurons in an exponential rate, because we have like divisions of cells that generate. So even if you just put a very simple model for proliferation, even a tiny change in the rate, of course, will generate 1 billion times more neuron than you actually find. So how you can build this robustness into the system? And ideally,
Okay. Now I understand better. So can I rephrase it by saying that the macroscopic behavior, it's always the same, even with perturbations or without perturbations. So in some sense, the macroscopic behavior is defined by the robustness of those rules with respect to perturbations.
Okay.
Like the macro states that survive imagine that I have a certain number of initial conditions for neurons, and I'm randomly changing the rules in which they proliferate.
Yes.
A lot of them will give you an organism that is just not going to survive. It's probably not even an organism, right? Yeah. Which rules are good rules? The ones that give you an organism that we know that survives at that temperature. So that's what you're saying, that there is some kind of duality between the macroscopic behavior that we observe and the rules in terms of, and they are selected by the robustness with respect to environmental changes.
Yes, I mean it's not exactly the entropy you're talking about, but there's a bit of like an entropic reasoning where we are looking for states that have a lot of microstates that can generate them, rather than simply states that minimize the energy. So I minimize some sort of free energy, so to speak, configuration of free energy for a network, something like that.
No, I think you're absolutely correct. Yes. I think this has to be true. And this is one way in which you can kind of understand why a system in a certain environment evolves with certain rules and not with another set of rules.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the actual network, the way it exists, it looks very arbitrary. And most biologists explain them in terms of, well, that's like evolution went out to these blind alleys and just keep aggregating these features that don't have any particular purpose. It's just what happened throughout evolution. But I suspect, and there's a suspicion of mine, that this is a way of nature of creating something that's robust by adding these new elements that interact in a way that, in a way, control these sensitivity to the detailed state of the microstate, generate a similar output that's functional. That's my suspicion.
You mean like in terms of something like feedback loops, in the sense that, okay, we explore that route, we know that it doesn't work, so let's just not use it.
No, it's like this. Imagine you have like imagine this abstract space of all the potential, or a set of potential networks and probabilities that you can have. And the naive Darwinian way would be, okay, what is like the smallest network that can generate these big brains? Okay, but that's probably not very robust, because if you change a little bit here, some of these small elements, then you break
over here.
So you're looking for like a different region in this configuration space where there's a broad class of microstates generate broadly the same output. Okay, so it's in a very similar way of looking. Instead of looking for minimizing energy, we're looking for minimizing free energy, because you want low energy, but you also want high entropy. Okay, so you equilibrate them, and you somehow evolutionary pressure becomes, or the randomness of your environment takes the role of temperature.
Yeah.
All uncertain environment, the higher the temperature, the more you favor entropy rather than energy, and vice versa. Does that make sense? I mean,
yes, no, it does, absolutely. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think that this can be made rigorous, at least in at least in toy models, we can 100% make it quantitative and rigorous, because so what you're saying, like the way I'm translating it, is that there's a cost function.
Yeah.
Basically, and the cost function is at the higher level.
Yes.
That cost function determines which rules are allowed and which are not allowed, loosely speaking, or like you said, in more
evolutionary,
precisely, favored and not favored.
Yeah.
But yes, and definitely the organizational structure at the macroscopic scale is the cost function. So it's telling, because you assume that there's been a lot of evolution before we came, and so the way we are organized, it's definitely part, like the result of these kinds of process. And so the organizational structure, or in other words, if you think about your space in terms of points and microstates, they are organized in macrostates.
Yeah.
So that organization in macrostates carries the information about the cost function that the rules basically fill.
Okay, let me think about this for a bit, and I'll try to write up something and send it to you. You tell me what you think, because I've been trying to make this model. I mean, it's not how to make the models work, but it's how to make the models work without fine-tuning.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yes.
So I want to see a way of an organic way of getting rid of fine-tuning by selecting for networks which are robust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop asking questions now, even though I still have a bunch. But if you have time, I have one last question I want to go back in the end about the scientific process.
I have time. I don't know if there are more questions.
Cool. So people, any other questions?
I have more basic questions. I have them written down here. One I can put all together. In some part of the presentation, you said that information needs a physical support.
Mm-hmm.
So no, I can't even understand what I write, but I remember what I'm trying to say. That information needs a physical support, and therefore information is somehow organization of the physical system, and then we can correlate information with entropy. And then on top of that, how we can define more precisely information, entropy, complexity, because these are more basic questions than.
So no, I think you're right in the first part, in which information needs a physical support. To me, and that's the way I interpret it. Other people can give you a slightly different answer, but they're all in the same flavor. The way I think about this is that what this means is that information, it's really a relational thing. It's about the relation between two things. And so the fact that it needs physical support means that basically it's something that we are asking about something else, and that something else needs a physical support. So it could be mass, it could be charge, or whatever. So in some sense, it's about the language that we use when we speak about information. And so, like, the fact that it needs physical support, it's a conceptual thing in terms of how do we interpret information, but it's also a very practical thing, because it means that however abstractly you think about concepts of information, there's always a physical support behind it. So you're guaranteed that those statements will have a counterpart in the real world.
Yes. And as the entropy has to do with the complexity, not complexity of the system, but the organization of the system. And when we are, I don't know, we can directly, I don't know how to put it, but
no, I understand your concern, and let me give you one possible answer. Entropy is about memory. That's what it really is about. So we attached a lot of meaning to entropy because it comes from our experience, from thermodynamics. But at the level of information theory, entropy is really about the ability that you have to memorize information. High entropy means, so intuitively imagine that those time series that I showed you. A time series that has no entropy rate, it's a time series that you can memorize without any sort of cost. It means that if you know the initial conditions and the rules of the game, then you can predict infinitely large, you can predict the future of that thing without having to memorize results. If on the other side, if there is a lot of randomness, if you want to reproduce that series, the only way that you can do that is by memorizing the results and just reproducing them. So entropy really quantifies the ability that we have to memorize in a compressed and efficient way the information that that time series is telling us. So for example, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. You don't need to, you just need the first symbol. If it's a 0, you know what all the next ones will be. If it's a 1, you know what all the next ones will be, which is not true when there is randomness. And so entropy, the real meaning of entropy, is in that sense. It's about our ability to memorize information in an efficient way. Now, what statistical complexity does is slightly different, but it's connected. So it's slightly different because it has a different physical meaning. We're trying to capture a different aspect of that behavior. And the aspect that we're trying to capture is that in certain cases, I need to memorize I need to know one rule of the game because there is only one. In another case, there are 2 rules, 3 rules, 4 rules, and so on and so forth, right? So how do we classify those different behavior? We do that with the statistical complexity, and the statistical complexity is still an entropy because it's about us having to memorize the rules of the game, but it's about memorizing the rules. So
okay,
intuitively we call it complexity because think about the differences between I don't know, what is a simple game? Tris, right? Or chess.
yes,
Intuitively, you would immediately say Tris is simpler than chess. Why? Because there is more rules to remember in chess, right?
right.
And that is the notion of complexity that quantity C provides a quantitative version of.
Okay. And then just 2 more short questions. The first is, in the beginning of the presentation, you talk a little bit about the Landauer Principle when you raised some information.
Right.
There is something that we can tear apart, that the information is some physical objects alone, or is somehow a statistical property. I'm thinking about the brain, how we can, there is something that can differentiate that in the brain the information is stored in, I don't know, some separated physical objects, or is something a statistical property of the whole brain system. I was thinking about that when you talk about the Landauer principle.
I think that we have to be, because of one of the statements that we made before, that information needs a physical support, you need to be more specific about information about what you're talking about. So I can think about one sense in which you can talk about information in the brain is information about the distribution of electrical charges. This is some form of information. Would that give you a model for the memories that we form as, adult organisms?
Yes, that's my question. How we can step forward in answer that question?
I think one problem with defining memories like that, or in fact, one problem with working with the brain and trying to define states in the brain is that you have, for intelligence and memory and cognition, you have so many types of processes occurring at very different time scales. So you have like milliseconds for, say, an action potential to be propagated, and you have like the other seconds for plasticity in synapses to take form, and you have like years for the shape of the brain to form and for axons to propagate, to form connections. So as soon as you define one scale of time, you're leaving out a whole bunch of other processes which we know are relevant, but cannot be really well described in a scale that is thousands or tens of thousands times shorter than the scale where those processes occur. So we have many scales that are very different orders of time magnitude. I think that's a big problem while trying to understand the brain in that sense.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And so what that makes me think about with respect to answering or trying to answer Victor's question is that what you could do ideally would be identify the right time scale. We know that like memories are, we formed, I don't know, I'm just, I'm using my own experience, so I don't know the biology, the version of this, but I know that it takes a certain amount of time to form a memory in my brain, right? And so say that you have identified that time scale. You know what it is. But like Bruno said, you know that there are relevant processes that affect that behavior on both sides of the time scale. In other words, there are processes that occur at a much shorter time scale that have an impact on that. And there are processes that occur at a much longer time scale that have an impact on that. So what you can do is that if there's enough separation of scales, like between milliseconds and years, you can try and treat the extremely short one in a statistical way. So in other words, they're not going to have a detailed impact, but only a cumulative impact. So make a statistical model of those effects, try to understand what's their cumulative impact with respect to your time scale, and that is one side of the modeling. And the other side of the modeling could be non-stationary time series. So for example, situations that I can imagine that, if I make if I take a snapshot of how my memories are stored in my brain now, I'm sure it's going to be different in a year from now. But for a lot of the, let me call it the important memories, there's going to be differences, but not a lot of them, right? So you can imagine that on the year's time scale, these change occurs in a smooth and simple, in a very slow way. And so you could try and mimic those with, model those with non-stationary time series, where the non-stationarity, it's very small over time, like adiabatic perturbations, for example. So to try and answer Victor's question, one way could be that you model statistically with the cumulative effect, the shorter time scale, and you model with perturbations and adiabatic perturbations the longer time scales, but then you still need to figure out what are the relevant states for your system. And as far as I know, I don't think we have that answer. Biologically, we don't know exactly how. We know that there are such things, but we don't know how they're stored exactly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
If no one else has, I have two questions, and probably that would be it. So the first one, you compare chess against another simpler game, right?
Trace, yeah.
Yeah. How would your mindset of comparing complexity would compare chess against Go?
Against Go?
Yeah.
Huh.
Go have incredibly simple rules.
Yeah.
But any development in the actual game can be incredibly complex and rich and interesting. And for the most part, I'm personally I'm a Go player, but I have played chess. It can be much more complicated playing Go than chess.
I agree.
But it's not self-evident in the rules that's going to be the case. In a sense, like the way I conceptualize that is that instead of actually having complex rules, you have complex dynamic coming from simple rules.
Yeah. Yes, I think that they go in slightly different directions. Like what you're talking about is complexity of the observed behavior.
Yes.
It's not complexity of the rules.
No, absolutely not.
Right.
But but when you're observing either physical or social whatever system, we rarely know the underlying rules. When you are lucky enough, we can figure out the rules. But most of the time, what we actually observe is the behavior.
Right. Right. And the behavior of Go is, I agree with you. It's more complex than chess. Yeah, but I mean.
But how did that go about on the measures of complexity on complexity?
I think the answer is that in a game like chess, you could have higher statistical complexity than Go, but lower entropy rate. So the entropy, the lower potential entropy rate. Think about memorizing all possible configurations of a chessboard.
Okay.
Right? And think about memorizing all possible configurations of a Go board.
It's way more difficult to do it for Go.
That is the complexity that you have in mind, and this is about entropy rate.
Okay. Can I just say something here? Because I was thinking, okay, I'm not sure if that's true, because Go has only one type of piece, while chess has many types of piece. So if just like naively take all possible configurations of all chess pieces on a 64 square grid, then you may have like a comparable number of configurations.
No, it doesn't, Bruno. It's something like 10 to the 50 for chess and 10 to the 160 for Go.
Wow.
Yeah, because the board, so the key thing is the 64 in the chessboard. I think it's 64, right?
Yeah, it's 8 by 8.
For Go, I don't know how many there is.
It's 19 by 19.
Okay, and that, so yeah, you're comparing exponents. Yes. And see, like and it's like comparing 64 with 19 by 19, which is insane.
Because one thing that I thought about the difference when we're playing Go and chess, when you're playing chess in a certain position, usually, even if you're not a very good player, there are like 2 or 3 plays that you consider. I mean, most other plays are completely stupid, and you discard them more or less immediately. So
yeah, that's true.
Effective tree of possibilities, it's much more pruned than in Go, because in Go, you may consider like 5, 6, 10 different plays, and it's not obvious that most of them are stupid. So a good player might choose the right one, but the options are much larger at each play. So
yeah. There are points that you funnel down when you have fights or very, very intense exchange between the two players. You can funnel down to a couple of moves. But yes, you have this. In a sense, it's like when you play Go, it's like playing more than one board of chess at the same time. You have to choose which board you're going to play. It can get messy. So you would understand that as a entropy rate feature, not so much as a complexity feature. Okay.
It's exactly, I mean, the example that you made, Bruno, is exactly like the way, like you just said it, right? At each time step, the next possible moves increase way more in Go than in chess. And that is about entropy rate because it's about the statistics of possible futures at the next step and how much entropy is produced, which means, in other words, how many choices can you make?
Yeah, so in your terms, I was thinking that Go has a much higher H value compared to chess rather than a C value. Right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
The second question is much more operational question than actually conceptual question.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I have been trying to do is apply machine learning techniques to engineering applications. So the idea you would have one of the works we have been doing, we have an offshore pipeline project. They run hundreds of simulations. If you could not run hundreds of simulations, run dozens of simulations, it's cheaper, everyone be happy, etc. And one of the problems we find out when trying to do this is that you actually have to rewrite your data somehow in a way that's amenable for the machine learning algorithm to do it.
How do you mean?
For example, you have to, adimensionalize variables. You have to normalize everything.
Okay.
But there are some available choice if you wish. For example, you can normalize. You have, like, for example, you can normalize either each feature, what is like one component of the variables that characterize your data, or you can, for example, normalize one big feature that, for example, encodes the entire current structure that goes on the sea. And there are some of those that are more physically sound, if you may, like more physically intuitive than others. And one funny thing that I found out is usually when you choose the more physically intuitive ways, the algorithm converges faster. The machine learning algorithm actually understands better what's going on.
Yeah.
But when I try to explain this to people from computer science, they look like I'm talking alien language, because they say, why would this be different? And one thing I was trying to think about, is there any way to quantify this? How, for example, if these choices would yield something with lower complexity or lower entropy, probably would suggest that the algorithm, since it's less complex, then the machine learning algorithm would learn easier.
I think
how would express this idea? I'm not sure.
I understand exactly what you mean, and this is connecting. In fact, so historically, this computational complexity from the side of my supervisor, it comes from a slightly different set of questions, which are pattern emergence, like in turbulent fluids.
Yeah. Yes, true. That's true.
Right, and so a question that appears there, as it appears in your case, is what is the most effective representation of that data? Yeah,
that's the way I was trying to conceptualize this. What's the most? Because, for example, if you're talking about, for example, harmonic data, and you basically nail the harmonics,
yeah,
you can get away with like three coefficients. If you don't nail the harmonics, you need to get the entire time series.
Exactly. Okay, so in that framework, what you just described, it's one of the two aspects, right? Because what you described is efficiency, statistical efficiency, or sorry, it's compressing the information in the most efficient way, right? So you're a physicist, Jose?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
So
I'm a physicist, and I did my PhD on statistical modeling of turbulence. So
okay. All right. So if you have a signal that it's periodic, like you said, if I use Fourier basis, the representation is going to be super sparse. I'm going to need whatever, like the first three harmonics.
Yeah.
But if I use monomial basis, it's just going to be terrible, right?
That's true.
You need an insane amount of coefficients. And even if it's super huge, because of the characteristics of monomials like
they're stiff, and yeah.
It's just going to be bad. So that is one side. So efficiency of the representation in terms of kind of how many coefficients do you need to represent that signal? I think that part is mapped into the H. So these, in other words, these epsilon machines, they are optimal representation of the dynamics of those data. And they're optimal in two senses. One is the one that you just described, and that is about entropy rate. So the fact that on average, inherently, there is a certain amount of regularities in the data, and we can use those regularities to compress the information. But there is a little bit of noise. And so the entropy rate is not zero, but maybe it's small, right?
Small,
so you have a lot of regularities, so you can compress a lot, but there is still some left over. Now, the regularities in both the regularities and the randomness, they're not there in an, kind of in a way that doesn't have shape or form. They are there in specific ways, right? And those specific ways are the arrows between those causal states. So that representation, which is the one that has minimal entropy rate and minimal statistical complexity, is the optimal because it gives you the shorter description because H is smaller, and the simpler one in terms of dynamically generating possible evolution, because the number of rules that you're employing to represent those data is the minimal possible, because we have minimality theorem, as long as the series is stationary. So in a certain sense, that representation in terms of circles and arrows is the optimal representation of those data, of those dynamical data. And so going back to your machine learning algorithm, what I imagine is that if I have a fixed algorithm that is trying to learn the behavior of some dynamical system, if I do some form of pre-processing that goes well with the underlying structure of the epsilon machine, then the algorithm will learn it in a much faster way. Right? Because it will get a simpler description.
Sure.
And so effectively, what is happening is that machine learning algorithm, it's learning representations of that dynamic that are not optimal.
Sure.
So it takes more time.
So
and more data.
Okay, if So let's say I go on and try to talk to a manager and offer the following proposition. Let's couple our learning algorithm, but before feeding the learning algorithm, we actually create your absolute machine and try to find this representation before actually feeding the data. Would that be it? The, like agnostic way to produce this optimal
can you say it again?
So for example, I have raw data. Basically, whatever data either the simulation package or the sensors spit, usually it's not by any stretch of imagination the best way to do it. Usually what I do is that I look at the data and try to, as a physicist or as an engineer, talk to the guys and say, all right, what's the physical components? The most important guys is these eigenvalues or this plane or this whatever. And then I say, all right, instead of computing that, I compute, get the raw data, compute these important physical variables, and then I train the model.
Mm-hmm.
The way to, but this intermediary step is completely handcrafted.
Right.
And there kind of lies a problem because it 100% relies on actually having people there thinking and not doing a mistake.
Right. So my answer would be, I understand where you're going. And I think the answer to that question is that what those theorems about the absolute machine are telling you is that step needs to be, if you want the optimal representation, that step needs to be done in a very specific way.
All right. I can substitute this handcraft step for an actual machine, whatever. That's your work.
You need to learn the causal states.
Okay.
Which means that what you need to do is basically, practically would be the following. The first thing that I do is that I look at the one-body marginals. And so I want to check stationarity, right? So one-body marginal, like what is the probability of 0 and 1 in one single thing, right? And this should be stationary. So your average over 10 time steps should not depend on where you are beginning your counting, right?
Okay.
Once you have the one-body marginals, what you can start doing are the empirically reconstructing the conditional probabilities. So if I see a 0 at time t, what is the probability that I see another 0 at time t plus 1? You get the statistics by changing t. So in other words, you have your infinite time series, you center in you choose one beginning, and this is your t. And then you say, okay, at time t, this can be either 0 or 1. Okay, I got my one body distribution. Second thing I ask is, assuming that it's 0, how many times will I get another 0? And you do the statistics over all your data. And then you ask, assuming that it's 0, what is the probability that I get a 1, right? And in this way, you reconstruct all the conditional distributions. You have all, imagine that you can do this, right? You can, it's not too hard to think that you can put this in an algorithm, right?
Sure.
And then what you do?
Basically, you do like an iterative cascade of histograms by the end of the day.
Yes, but they have to be conditional. So it's, that the first one has to be 0, and then you look at the statistics over how many times you get a 1 after a 0 and how many times you get a 0 after a 0.
Okay, babe. So you get a directed graph of histograms, so directed cyclic graph, something like that.
Yeah. And of course, what you do is that you have to increase this knowledge on both sides. So what is the probability that after a 0, I get 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1? Right? And this is your conditional distribution, fixing the past and observing the conditional distribution in the future.
Okay.
Right? Now, imagine that you do this up to a length L.
Sure.
And you have all these conditional distributions. What you'll find out is that different paths will give you the same future behavior.
Okay.
And these are the causal states. Because by definition, the causal state is a situation for your process in which, irrespectively of how you got there, then your behavior, your future behavior will be determined by that state.
Okay, basically what you're trying to do is something like find something like a Markovian inflection point.
It's a hidden Markov model.
Okay. So you build a hidden Markov model from your data and try to find which are these nodal points that allow you to do your Markovian hypothesis.
I mean, it's the overall statistics is not Markovian. That's the advantage of using these ones, that by using hidden states, effectively you can model even non-Markovian behavior with Markovian hidden states.
Yeah, you add stuff that the overall bulk is Markovian, even if not, if the observable part's not.
Exactly. The observed part is not, but your rules are Markovian, because by definition, rules are, I'm in this situation, what do I do? That's a rule.
Okay.
So rules by definition are Markovian. So if you want a rule-oriented representation of your non-Markovian behavior, you need to use hidden states.
Okay, fair.
And those hidden, that's how you find them. You take all the pasts, they give you your future behavior, your fixed future behavior, and that's one causal state. And so one future behavior could be, emit a 0, then a 0, then a 1. That's your future behavior. And then you keep going.
Okay. That's quite the...
It's involved. It's really
quite
intensive computationally. You're absolutely
yeah.
No, it's really intensive.
It's fascinating because it reminds me of some stuff I read on finance mostly. Because some of those people try to model like price changes, etc., using hidden Markov models, and the mindset's very close to what you're describing.
Yes. I mean, like this is like it takes ideas from definitely from stochastic processes, like in finance, but also from dynamical systems. The main problem with pricing there is that those time series are non-stationary, but they are non-stationary on time scales that can be whatever. I mean, you have no idea. Right?
Yes, exactly. That's the problem for placing bets. You actually don't know what you're dealing with.
Yeah, because I mean, even in physics, there are a lot of real things are not, they're described, but things that are not stationary. But within a certain time scale, you can use the stationarity assumptions because it's not going to change much, and then your prediction will be okay.
You can find the time scale. That's the nice part of the physics.
Yeah, in finances, you don't know what is the time scale because it's not fixed. It depends on how Elon Musk wakes up in the morning.
No, this is true. You can
it is.
A meme.
It's true. Like, it's insane, and so that kind of fluctuations is still well beyond regular behavior. But yeah, I mean, at its core, what I really like about this framework, it's very beyond the the information theoretic stuff, which I just think that it's only it's the right language to be general enough. But it's really that what it does, it's what a scientist does. You look at the data, you ascribe regularities to rules and randomness to chance. And then you say, okay, but randomness and rules are not separated. They coexist in a certain way. What is the best way for them to coexist? And you draw the circles, these diagrams, and that's the best way of doing it. And that is it's actually a very human way of thinking about stuff.
I was thinking that your whole model is like a synodoct for the scientific process, because we have this output that's continuing, but we have to stop somewhere, and then we have to try to deduce what's underlying mechanism, what sort of states that nature has, and what are the transition probabilities that nature has. And the deterministic paradigm is essentially saying that age equals 0.
Yeah. I mean, imagine like I've done just for the fun of, I mean, not just for the fun, because it's part of my research, but you can try and say, okay, now today I am Galileo. I have no idea about advanced physics, but I know that I'm able to figure out uniform motion, for example. How do I do that? How do I do it? And I mean, really, what he did is I just record positions as a function of time on a graph, and they draw a line. And a line, it's a relation that that can be explained. These are the regularities in the data. And then, but if you actually look in a detailed way, it's not really a line, right? There is a little bit of noise. So what you do is that you average it out, you get the regularities, and then whatever it's on top of this, you relegate to disorder, to randomness, to stuff that you're not able to exactly comprehend. And that is your model of deterministic behavior with a little bit of noise.
And that's really successful. That's what you said at the very beginning.
Yeah, I mean, even that idea has been incredibly, like, how all, like, 3 centuries of physics and progress rely on that very kind of conceptual way of tackling the problem.
I mean, half of the physics is like the first term in the Taylor series, and it works.
Sorry?
Half of physics is like the first term of a Taylor series, and it works.
Yeah, exactly.
That's true.
Yeah, it does.
Right.
It works as long as your representation of the data is correct.
Yes.
Right?
And robust.
That's the whole point. Because even if you, I mean, just think about, like, a particle that moves in space. There is a coordinate system that is not aligned to that. Like, this is my coordinate system, the particle is going here. And I need 3 numbers and 3 positions and 3 velocities to describe that.
Yeah.
But if I align my coordinate system in the right way, I only need 2 numbers, 1 position and 1 velocity.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's like one way of thinking about choosing the right representation. The other one could be Newton's equation of motion. If you need 2 things, right? You need the initial position and the initial velocity. And those are linear equations. So you have 2 linear equations, or you could have 1 equation that is second order, right? And I mean, what you're doing is that you're trading
variables for initial conditions.
Yeah, you're trading variables for initial condition, and that changes your representation. Because in one case, you have a second order, x2 dot equals something. In another case, you have x dot and p dot. And you're just changing your representation from a Markovian to a non-Markovian one.
There's an equivalent to Lagrangian formalism, like in terms of Markovian. So Markovian is like Hamiltonian. What would be the equivalent of Lagrangian?
Non-Markovian. So imagine this is
no Markovian. It doesn't depend on the entire history. It depends only on the first and second derivatives.
Yes, but it is it's not Markovian in a specific way.
Yeah.
It's not the most general non-Markovian behavior.
Okay.
But you know why more complicated forms of non-Markovian behavior can emerge? Because you have more particles. So your effective system is like 3 positions, 3 velocities per particle. And when you have, like 20 of them, they form the environment. And you know that maybe you're not interested in the behavior of all of them. You're interested in the behavior of a smaller system. I mean,
yeah. Okay.
Right?
The universe is Markovian. Your slice of the universe is not.
Exactly. Yeah. And how non-Markovian? How do you characterize these things? I mean, it's a general problem, right? We don't have the general answer yet.
Do a partial trace for the rest of the universe.
Sorry?
Do a partial trace for the rest of the universe.
You do a partial trace, and then you know that it's highly non-Markovian. You have no idea how to describe it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, this is exactly what I'm trying. This is exactly the problem that I'm trying to solve, right? Like you said, you do a partial trace, and then what? Like, it's highly non-Markovian, and I mean, like, there is no general way of tackling this problem unless, in a you can. I mean, this is what people have done so far. You assume Markovity no matter what,
And then hope for the best.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can reproduce certain behavior like equilibration to thermal equilibrium, but more general behavior, it's way more complicated. So how do you set up a set of equations that do that? Like the BBY-KG hierarchy is something like that.
Okay.
What that is?
That's the equivalent, Boltzmann equation.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So if you work, Boltzmann equation relies on that hypothesis that you can factor the pairwise collision distribution. If you can't, you actually have an additional correlation, and you need a separate equation to describe this additional correlation.
Okay.
So you do
the two-body distribution.
Which is the
two-body distribution, the behavior of the two-body.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yes, it's the distribution of the behavior of two-body. So you write what would be the Boltzmann equation for the two-body distribution, and you find out that it depends on the three-body distribution. And then you end up with like this hierarchy of arbitrary n-body distributions, and usually you can't do much about it. So for verified guesses, what people do is simply say, all right, you have no non-trivial two-body correlation, so you truncate at 2, and then you get Boltzmann's equation, which is awesome.
Yeah.
And the problem is sometimes you can have trivial, non-trivial two-body distributions, and what people do is they truncate on the next one. So you can have like, what was that? It was, I think, was heavy Fermi systems or something like that. That have a very strong two-body, but you can somewhat believe that it doesn't have strong three-body non-trivial correlations. So it was, I don't remember the exact name of the Kadanoff-Bain equations. You end up with what would be this more complex version of the Boltzmann equation. But yeah, you end up with this very increasingly complicated and nasty equations.
Yeah, and they are like the real representation of what's happening. So how do you deal with these things when you cannot truncate, or like the fact that particles interact only in pair does not mean that we only need pairwise correlations to describe them. And that's what the hierarchy really is about. It's about the lack of correlations beyond a certain number. And so how do you deal with these things? And it's highly non-trivial. So finding ways that are always true, for like techniques that you can always use to treat these problems, I think it's a very important problem. And if we manage to solve it, it will help. I mean, for example, it might give you exact transport equations, not approximated one. I mean, even looking at the like transport coefficients, the fact that there's only one scalar number of a bunch of numbers that collectively are able to fully characterize the behavior of transport, it's just not true in general.
Yeah.
There are tons of things that are happening and you just ignore them. But these things have a physical, like, they're physical. So on the one hand, they are resources that you can use to do stuff, to compute work. So like, why ignore them? On the other hand, if you want a more accurate picture, you just need to deal with them. Like the Boltzmann equation gives you an entropy that is monotonically increasing, right? Which is approximately correct. But we do know that this is actually not true. If you look at the entropy over time, I mean, you know that there are fluctuations, right?
Yeah.
And those fluctuations cannot be described by that model because the entropy can only increase. Once it gets there, it's just going to stay there. So, I mean...
But you can get these fluctuations by taking into account like higher end particle interactions?
Yeah, you can get sizes of fluctuations from other arguments without the need to go there. So for these examples, you don't need to. But you do know that there are more complicated behavior that you're just not able to describe.
Yeah, your point is that you know that Boltzmann equation is wrong because you measure fluctuations. By definition, it doesn't capture everything. Yeah. It captures somewhat in the long run. That's kind of the cheat that we always do.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you choose the interval correctly, you cheat. But yeah, that's a very interesting way to see the world, because it's as you said, it's very sciencey in feeling. I'm not sure if I'm getting the expression right.
Yeah.
Though it uses a language that sounds a lot like computer science, but it's not.
Yeah. I mean, I think the name computational mechanics it's appropriate. It tries to put together all these ideas and form a coherent theory of, I mean, like, really, if we're talking about things that would be really cool to do with this, I do think that in principle, this is the way to teach a computer the scientific method.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see.
I mean, can we really do it in general? I don't know, but I'm pretty sure we can do it for classes of problems. Like, I have no idea what this thing is doing. Tell it to me. You just feed it data, and it's just going to feed you the representation, which is going to be insanely complicated. But you know that it's by definition, it's the simplest one. And that's what you're going to study. And that will guarantee that you have the optimal representation in the sense that, you don't need more stuff than that. It's accurate, and you can play with it. You can try to understand it. And I mean, it is a way of understanding how things work. And you can teach it to a computer in principle. It's just really expensive computationally, but it also makes sense, right? If you want to have an exact representation of what is happening, you need to spend a lot of resources to get there.
Yeah, sure.
There's no
people.
One hot topic. Yeah, let's over. But one hot topic nowadays is I'm not sure if you read about like machine learning theorem proofing, and people are trying to do like this abstract reasoning and abstract algebra stuff mixed with AI.
Yeah.
And I think it's go right into the same direction as you mentioned, like trying to write like some people are trying to do this through this like COC, this computer Azure systems.
Mm-hmm.
There are people trying to just a second. Ok, pode subir. There are some people that are trying to do this through like a natural language processing. There are people fiddling with this, especially because recently like there was a boom in this area. But it would be interesting to see what could be done, like mixing this with what you're doing, because like would be, for example, how would Pythagorean theorem goes? How would you understand the Pythagorean theorem, for example? That's a very simple, at least it feels simple. What would be the representation of it, or the proof of it?
Yeah, I don't know, but yeah, no, I understand exactly what you're saying, and I agree. It's incredibly interesting because I mean, there are different people use slightly different approaches, but I think a lot of people are trying to solve this problem just with different approaches. And I mean, nowadays that like people were able to extract differential equations from data, right? This is like,
yes, exactly.
It's a huge area.
Yeah, it's incredibly interesting.
Yeah. This goes, so just to give you an idea, what I gave you are discrete examples, like the alphabet is discrete, 0, 1, 2, 3, or whatever. What happens when the alphabet is the continuous system? Well, epsilon machines are going to be differential equations.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense, but it should give you the best way to extract differential equations from data. I mean, there's really a lot to explore. But yeah, the connection with natural language processing, I think it's particularly fitting because if
you can give me a minute, I have something to address here.
Sorry?
I have a delivery to attend here. Just a second.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, while he's away, I'll just ask you something really quick. So you say you're working on the physics of information, and on the Shannon paradigm, information is essentially minus the entropy. Like entropy is a measure of ignorance, where information measures how much information it describes something. Is there any distinction between those two in your? So is information entropy about the same thing with a change of signs, or you have different concepts that?
No, I think so the way I think about information is literally as surprisal.
Uh-huh.
So it's like minus log of p. So for me, the more appropriate analogy would be that if this is probability theory and this is information theory, they are the same thing, just described in a different basis.
Okay.
So yeah, one of them is like the fundamental one, like the probability of events that we know that are distinguishable, but each of them and their mixing have no appropriate functional description. What has a functional description are combinations of these objects that can be linear combinations or nonlinear combinations. And, surprisal, which is minus log of the probability, it's one of those combinations that has a particularly important interpretation. And so when I think about information, I think about two things. This is one, so surprisal in the sense that if I have, something that can be in 0, 1, 2 states, and the probability of observing 2 is incredibly low, minus log of that probability is is how much I'm surprised if that value comes up, right? If probability of observing 0 is 50% minus 10 to the minus 5. Probability of observing 1 is 50% minus 10 to the minus 5. And probability of observing 2 is 2 times 10 to the minus 5. Minus log of P2, it's my surprisal if when I extract the value, I get a 2. I'm more surprised. So I get more information on that system.
In your paradigm, you have like the source of this price can be twofold. It can be due to a random choice between 0 and 1 or 2 for one given state, or it may be due to the fact that you're in a different state. So you have some states where P2 is more likely than other states. Those tell you different things, right? I mean, one tells you that by chance something happened, the other tells you the system is at such a state. That's why I said the scientific process, the reductionist paradigm essentially assumes that age equals 0, so that's only one of those factors. So is there any way other than just taking large time series to differentiate between these two types of surprise?
I think one of them is about the environment your system is in.
Okay.
In some way, the environment determines both situations at the same time. It determines the probabilities that you're observing because it creates randomness, but also dynamically, it determines whether you're more likely to observe one of the two things in that specific situation. So I think it really is about understanding how the environment has an effect on your system. And this is why I think information in that sense, it's relational, because it's not about the system, it's about how the system behaves with respect to the environment. And with environment, I mean, it can be thermal environment, but it is anything else that it's not that system.
That's one of those partial traces we're talking about, which leads me to my final question, which is this. So using these epsilon machines and a stationary distribution, you can deduce from your time series what is the simplest set of states and probabilities that can generate that situation. Now, these transitions are probabilistic, but let's imagine that these are due to some sort of partial trace. And in fact, each of your states is a set of unobserved states that are deterministic, and only in aggregate, they generate a probabilistic microstate. Can you imagine some sort of like a meta-epsilon machine that can deduce the deterministic network that can generate the probabilistic network that generates the time series?
Oh, yeah. They're called, yes, they're called mixed states.
Okay.
Yeah, and they, surprise, that's kind of where I was going with. Actually, I'm connecting to natural language processing. They form a hierarchy. So you analyze the first level, and you get your epsilon machine, and maybe your epsilon machine has an infinite number of causal states, each with their own probability. So because it's an infinite number of causal states, what you can try and do, you can describe the internal dynamic that your system is going through the network, right? How do you describe this? Well, the alphabet becomes the causal states.
Okay.
And then you describe that sort of dynamic, and you move a layer up. Eventually, at some point, what you will reach is full Markovity and determinism. That's I mean, hopefully, right? You get to a description that it's completely deterministic, and from where you can infer, going down those levels, you can infer the observed behavior. But this, you know what this is? This is the Chomsky hierarchy of languages. When you move from one layer to another, and you can move from one layer to another using the epsilon machine description.
Okay. But it means
Okay,
that you have
so
an absolute quantity, but something that depends on how your coarse grain system or how you partial tracing it.
That's the key point, because the epsilon machine are optimal. There's no better way of doing it.
Okay.
So what you're trying to say is that you can guess what would be the minimal representation of the rest of the universe.
You can try.
You can try at least by moving up the hierarchy, as you say.
Yeah.
So when you get from an initial time series that's not Markovian, and at least you improve the Markovianity of it, in the sense that you lower the dependency on the past. So I don't know how you measure this, but it's probably you introduce additional states that are hidden. These guys are somewhat optimal way to represent whatever you're not seeing that affects your system.
Yeah, exactly. That's the hidden information. It's hidden because you don't see it, either because you have access only to a local thing, or because for some reason in your modeling, you just don't have access to those degrees of freedom. And so it could be, for example, that those hidden degrees of freedom are the other particles in your gas that like at some point in the past have interacted with your portion, and they're leaving traces. And those traces are written in their evolution, they're accumulated over time. And so going up in the hierarchy in formal languages, it's a way of getting finite description of those kinds of behavior. Because again, you could have, I mean, if you do the partial trace and you look at, I mean, what can you hope to infer from looking, I don't know, at the physics of in my room about the whole universe? There's a bunch of stuff that you can do, but a lot of details will just, you don't have
not be there. Yeah,
will not be there. So how do you do, how can you do it? Well, first you generate a model that it's finite. When you have a finite model, what you realize is that in order for you to get to a finite model, you had to basically cope with the fact that there are infinities of causal states that you don't know where they're coming from. So what you do typically is that you enlarge your basic description, and you're saying, okay, maybe my room is not enough because it is giving me description that need an infinity of causal states. So I'm including my room and, everywhere on Earth. And now the accuracy of my description improves, and it's still finite. But of course, if I want more and more details, I mean, these are like, it's like Matryoshka. These are nested things. Once you have an infinite number of causal states, you know that you need to get a hierarchy above for you to have a finite description.
Okay, turtles all the way up.
It's I mean, there is an end, or at least that's that's what we believe, right? That
okay.
Like what currently we believe, like the best description is quantum mechanics and some form of quantum gravity. We have no idea what that could be. But
okay.
most people believe that there should be some form of quantization of gravity, just because classical gravity in certain region doesn't make sense. So we know that we need something that replaces those parts, but in the other regions, it's fine. If the whole thing is a huge wave function that evolves unitarily, that's your ultimate turtle.
Okay.
Right? And that, by definition, that is Markovian, because it's a huge wave function, and it's an operator that you apply to it, and you don't need to, you only need to remember your previous state to proceed.
Yeah, sure.
So that's Markovian. But how does it show up in our locality? Insane noise, a lot of stuff that we don't understand. And that is like,
True.
if you have access to all the details, an infinite number of causal states that you don't know how they're organized.
Sure.
And then you go above and above, and like these going above and above could be really, I don't, like, these are tentative answer. I don't, of course, this is a huge problem. I don't have the definitive answer, but
I'm curious about, I mean, if you think of these turtles all the way down, I'm curious not on the ultimate turtle, but I mean those turtles in the between that actually a fairly good description of what goes above, like classical physics or the neural network in terms of neurons as individuals, right? I mean, why those particular turtles manage to encompass most of the information that you need for everything that goes above, right? Why don't I need QCD to send a probe to Mars, right? So those are questions I'm interested in.
Well, I think that's fairly, like, it could be separation of scales in terms of energy,
sure,
or in terms of time, or it could be, I mean,
yeah, probably it's not, that's not the worst situation to solve, but one that came to my mind is following on what he said. You don't need QED to send people to Mars. But one thing that I was thinking is the following: every grad student computes every at least where I study computes the G factor for the electron, and computes the alpha spectrum for the hydrogen, and you compute first for the Bohm's atom, then for Schrödinger's atom, then for Dirac's, and then if you go to quantum field theory classes, then you try to, for example, compute like the lump shifts or something like that. Would it be conceivable, like, to gather some of these data and say, all right, let's say you start with Dirac's representation. You have a relativistic quantum mechanics, then you measure it's not true. Can you advance from there? And it, for example, propose, all right, you need this representation plus something, and the plus something that the epsilon machine spits is, for example, the first order loop or the of QED.
Like, I don't know.
But it would be funny if it was, right?
It's not crazy, right? It makes sense.
It would feel the correct thing to be, but it'd be amazing if it actually did it. That's what I was thinking. Because coming from like Schrödinger's hydrogen atom to G equals 2, it's like huge jump.
Yeah.
But it feels not that much of a jump coming from, for example, Dirac's atom to the first correction from QED.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't. I don't know. Now that I think about it a bit more, I'm not sure. So one crucial thing that changes when you go up a layer in the epsilon machine hierarchy is that your new alphabet is different.
Okay, it's not just an extension from the previous one.
No, you actually change your alphabet, which is what allows you to compress that information into something that it's finite. It's like it's like when you have I don't know, some new concept that you come in contact with. What is the first thing that people do? They give it a name, right? Because you need some way of addressing it. And so you're creating, so like you have letters, right? With letters, you form words. And with words, you form speeches. And with speeches, you form conferences. You know, like it depends of which, if you want to describe everything, starting from letters, what you realize is that, okay, you can put together letters in different ways, but the number of causal states that you'll see are going to be infinite. So what do? You take those causal states, and then you have a new language. You have new letters, and you go up a layer.
Okay, the problem is not having infinite availability of words, but is the problem is how many words how as few words you need to describe what you want. Is that it? Because you want it to keep infinite.
It's about scaling. So it's like saying, our allegedly, our three space dimension, to describe them, you need, like an infinite number of points.
Sure.
Right? Because, they are, quantum gravity allowing it, but they are continuous. So there's an infinite number of points in one direction. There's an infinite number of points in another direction. There is an infinite number of points in another direction. So, but, at our scale, this is really not a problem. Newton and Leibniz taught us how to deal with these infinite and infinitesimal quantities, as long as you understand the scaling. And the scaling is fixed, it's 3, right? It's 3-dimensional. So this is how, when you move up a layer, even if you have an infinite number of causal states, if you understand the scaling property and it's fixed, then you're fine, because you have a new language that it's targeted on that scaling. And so it's like saying, okay, we only need 3 dimensions. So even if it is an infinite number of points, it's fine, because we have a language and we can do physics with it.
Okay. It's a very enticing way to think.
I know, it's like when I was looking for, my actual project was, I'm here with a fellowship that it's for understanding the transport of information. And I had, at the beginning, I had completely different ideas. But now what I'm like, this is absorbing me so much. I truly believe in this framework and in its potential, and it's really interesting. But it's also computationally very expensive. So to prove that it yields result, it's a balance between finding the right problem that you can treat and having the right resources in terms of computational power. Because if you tell somebody that you need, an insanely large computer to solve that problem, I mean, that's just not useful. Who cares? I mean, it's cool to think about it, but if it doesn't solve real life problem, but it does. I mean, people have used it in a bunch of different cases. So it's not that common, not yet, because it's computationally very expensive. So for example, dealing with large alphabet, it scales badly. It's just the way it is.
I'm surprised it didn't scale badly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Right.
Yeah. But yet, as long as the things that you're interested are limited and you can identify them in a good way, I think you can use it however you like. I mean, for your own purposes. It's like you can apply this idea to, this is what we are doing, right? We are applying this idea to the foundations of physics. But you don't have to. You can apply it to other kinds of problems, and it should work in the same way, right? I mean,
yeah, sure.
And so I think it's sufficiently flexible to allow you to do both. Yeah.
That's really cool. Okay, people, we have been talking for 3 hours now.
Oh,
yeah.
really?
Yes, it was quite the afternoon.
Okay.
It's probably like past lunchtime for Fabio. So I think we should wrap up now. And thank you very much. This was truly fascinating. There's so many things that I still want to ask you about and talk about, but I think we should give it a pause, have something about it, and perhaps we can continue these conversations through email or through some
I'm happy to. Absolutely.
And so, Fabio, I'll ask just one last thing. Just can you send me through WhatsApp 2 or 3 references, introductory stuff people can read, perhaps some work you've done. So when you put that on YouTube, we can list them as well. So it will become a good introduction for what you've done. Okay?
Will do. Absolutely. There is a bunch of papers that my PI wrote that are there. I mean,